Hello, everyone. Welcome back. This week, we're going to be talking about length of stay, how to calculate the length of stay, why it matters, and we have a short video lecture for you. So let's take a look at length of stay. Again, this is dealing with length of stay. In other words, how long somebody's in the hospital. We'll be looking at length of stay for adults, children, and newborns. We'll look at the total length of stay for group of discharged patients, and then we'll interpret the relationship between length of stay and utilization management. So what the length of stay is basically the first bullet point. It's the number of calendar days that a patient stays in the hospital from admission to discharge. And this factors in with utilization management. In other words, are we managing the patient at the right level of care? Do we have somebody in the hospital who maybe could be discharged and followed by home health or followed up by an outpatient or what have you? And the statistic we use for this is the average length of stay. We talked about averages earlier in the course, and what averages do is basically it's a measure of central tendency. Another figure that you hear about in the hospital setting is discharge days. And discharge days is basically the days of stay from the hospital after they've been discharged from the hospital. We also refer to this as inpatient days of stay or duration of inpatient hospital. Let's take a look at how we can factor these and calculate these. It's pretty straightforward. Each patient a patient is in the hospital is counted as a discharge day, with the exception of, ironically enough, the day of discharge, because they're going home. So the length of stay for one patient is determined by subtracting the date of admission from the date of discharge. So we have somebody who's admitted on October the 30th and discharged on the 31st. We take that date, 31, and subtract 30 and have a length of stay of 1. And when we use the terms discharges, we always think of people going home. It also includes people that are discharged alive and anybody who dies in-house or in the hospital. And patients who are admitted and discharged on the same day are actually considered to have 1 day length of stays. And there's a couple of ways we can do this. So in this example, we start with a patient that's admitted on March the 31st and discharged on April the 4th, and we can calculate it back, right? So we have 5-day length of stay there because they're discharged on the 4th, 30th, 31st, 1st, 2nd, 3rd discharged. And we can list the days, right? So we took a look at this, basically just counting them up on a calendar like we just saw. Sometimes we'll have these segments go into months, right? So basically we transition from this and we calculate the month, right? So if somebody's discharged on the 4th, right, they were admitted on the 30th, the number of days that they have in April is 3. They have 1 March day from March 31st to the 30th, so it's a total of 5 days. But probably the easiest way to do this is to use Excel, as we've seen throughout the course. So we can use the Excel date function. And we don't think of dates as being something we can subtract, but we actually can. If you take a look right here, you have the date March the 30th, April the 4th. We calculate the discharge date minus this, and we have the length of stay is a value of 5. We can even do this in the outpatient setting, right? So instead of talking about days, we're talking about minutes. So let's say somebody arrived in an outpatient unit at 8:05. They were examined at 8:22. 22 minus 5 is 17 minutes. Straightforward stuff. And again, if the hour is different, then we would do something similar to method 3, where we count the number of days in 1 hour and then calculate it in the other. So we can have hour segments. So here's an example. Patient arrives at 1:11, is taken to the exam room at 3:02. We subtract 1 hour from 3:02 to 2:02, right? And now we have 2:62, if you will. So 2:62 minus 1:11 is 1 hour and 51 minutes, which was the patient's actual wait time. A lot of interest in this in the outpatient setting and hospital outpatient settings. So similar to what we have with inpatient service days, we can have the sum of the days of stays from any grouping of inpatients discharged, and this is the total discharge days. So you can see January over here, right? Length of stay 3 and 12, that's 15, right? Notice it's not the same as inpatient service days. So when we calculate the average length of stay, we have another formula, and this is something you can set up in Excel. We can have the total length of stay and then divided by the total number of discharges. And why do we care about this? Well, this is really useful to detect trends, patterns, kind of falls in line with MSDRGs and other things. What is the average length of stay? So here's an example from 5.12 in your book. We have the number of discharges, right? We have 67.392 discharge days. For total number of this, we would take the number of discharge days and the number of discharges and divide that number of discharges into the total of discharge days. In this case, we get a figure of 4.3. That's the average length of stay for adults and children. And again, like we've seen before, facilities count newborns separately. So we still count them, but they're not added in with the adults and children. This is really, really useful for those facilities that have NICUs. They really like to take a look at the average length of stay. And the reason that they are counted separately is that some preemies can stay in for months or longer in the PICU, the NICU. So we carve those out so we're just looking at stats and comparing apples to apples. And again, how do we do this? We do it the same way, but instead of taking adults and children, we take total newborn discharge days and then total number of newborn discharges. So in this case, for the month of January, we have 278 discharge days, and we have 103 discharges. So we get a figure of essentially 2.7. And again, just basically the formula, it's very, very similar. In both cases for newborns and adults and children, to figure the average length of stay, you take that total number of discharges and discharge days, excuse me. The total number of discharge days could be for a month, a quarter, a year. And then you divide it by the total number of discharges, and you would include deaths for the same time period. So that would be for the month, the quarter, the year, and then you will get the average length of stay. And I hope you found that useful. Please contact me if you have any questions. Thank you.